Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Geopolitically Incorrect. How's it going, Andrea?
It's going quite well, I guess. The situation has hit me. I'm a little bit fearful, though. I've
Yeah.
arrived to a point where I am even washing my hands after having a shower. It's probably a little bit extreme, but
Have you gone outside
yes,
recently?
actually, I have. It was the
Yeah.
first time, I think, in 2 weeks that I've stepped foot outside my building for
Jeez,
a
man.
whopping 7 minutes. So it was great. It was great.
7 minutes to do
Seven
what?
minutes. Nothing. Parked my car outside. That was it. But I mean,
Okay.
you can't do much in 7 minutes,
No,
I think.
there's nothing you can do much. There's nothing you can really do. But as we mentioned, the whole coronavirus isn't going to stop us, though. There is one thing we can do, and it's the episodes of Geopolitically Incorrect. As we mentioned, every
Every
Monday we're
Monday.
going to talk about geopolitics, or at least some current affairs, or even more, at least events in the past that we think are interesting and worthy of an analysis. So today, what are we going to talk about, Andrea?
Exactly. We're probably going to talk about the event that was the most important one on the news, at least, before the outbreak of coronavirus, obviously. And in fact, it's the death of General Qasem Soleimani for Iran, obviously.
All right, the death of the general at the beginning of 2020, the beginning of this year, that
Exactly.
sparked mass, fear that that World War III was going to
A
start.
potential World War III. Yeah.
So that's an interesting topic. So I guess what we can do is that we can talk about, we can try to answer four main questions. So who was he? How was he killed? Why was he killed? And if his death or if his assassination was made sense or not, if it makes sense, if it made sense to kill him or not. So first of all, who was General Soleimani?
Well, its story is quite interesting, and as much of Iranian history, I think, dates back to 1979, the famous Islamic Revolution, which took place in 1979, carried out by the Ayatollah Khomeini at that time. And after that, several different militias were actually formed in the several different countries outside of Iran. And
Yeah,
so
so
inside
Iran
of
so Iran essentially in 1979 had a Islamic Revolution, and
exactly,
now it's one of the few countries in the Middle East that is a predominantly Shia country. We have this Shia
exactly,
Sunni separation with the Middle East, where some countries are Sunni majority countries and some countries are Shia majority countries. The two main leaders are Iran being the Shia leader and Saudi Arabia being the Sunni leader. These are essentially two different branches of the Islamic religion.
exactly. And so inside of the army forces of Iran started to create a little bit of a group, which is called the Quds forces, which then became led by General Qasem Soleimani, who was, for some, has actually been described as the second most important person after the Ayatollah. Essentially, what these Quds forces did was to manage the different Shia militias outside of Iran in other countries, Lebanon, Iraq, or even Syria, obviously.
Yeah, because what's it called? Iran felt essentially Iran felt isolated within the Middle East. Because if you think about it, Iran is
It's
predominantly
the
one of
only,
the few Shia majority countries
exactly.
in the Middle East, and not only it's essentially isolated because Saudi Arabia has its alliance with the U.S. Turkey is part of NATO. And also has a strong alliance with the U.S. Israel alliance with the U.S. Many countries in the Middle East have an alliance with the U.S. There's the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and so in a way, Iran, especially after the revolution, felt isolated. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, it created this Quds force.
But more than that, they actually, the first part of the revolution in Iran was to control the country itself, but the second part is getting control of the whole Middle East. And so gaining a sort of control and connection with the Shia militias sparking everywhere is actually a very important thing to deal with. And actually, a fun fact about it is the fact that, Al-Quds is translated from Arabic into, guess what? Jerusalem. So yes, they actually want to gain control, one at least. We'll see what is going to happen in the future, to gain control of the whole Middle East, so,
Okay, so
which is
this
an
force
important
is
thing to do
called
with.
wait. So this force is called Jerusalem Force.
Exactly,
Okay,
exactly,
so the force of which Soleimani was commander is called the Jerusalem Force.
exactly.
Okay.
I think probably that's the end point. The end result is to take control of that, because it's a very holy place in the Quran, so it's a big deal for them, I think.
Got it. But yeah, no, essentially, I know that, yeah, so as we mentioned, the Quds Force is essentially this international military group of Iran with the intention of spreading Iran's ideology, but most importantly, Iran's political influence, geopolitical influence for the time being in the Middle East. And so the Quds Force have been present in Lebanon, in Syria, and importantly in Iraq. Soleimani became leader of the Quds Force towards the late 1990s, between 1997 and 1998. I think it's amazing that we don't know the exact date. It's rather secretive about this whole
I mean,
thing.
it's almost a spy organization, includes forces, so
Yeah, so it makes
it's
sense that they keep some facts in under the
exactly.
light. But yeah, over the years, essentially, what I know that is that the Quds Force have been participating in Lebanon, for example, during the Lebanese civil war. Iran, through the Quds Force, sent financial assistance, sent weapons to many Shia militias, which are essentially military groups that emerge out of nowhere in Lebanon to fight in the civil war, also against Israel.
Exactly. And this is kind of like the Quds force, how the Quds forces operate. First of all, they identify some sort of Shia militia groups in a country, and they
Okay.
send supplies of all sorts, as you said, weapons, soldiers, whatever. And then once those groups start to get more organized, they use them to obtain a political control, or at least a
Yeah.
political entrance, a little bit of a political entrance, either in those countries. And in Lebanon, they did just that. As after the Shia militias were able to fought back the invasion of Israel, they collaborated, they get organized, and they form Hezbollah. And
Okay. Hezbollah. Okay.
yeah,
Good night. Got it.
and actually Hezbollah means the party of God. So once again, it's a big deal. And similar thing occurring in Iraq, as you mentioned previously. This happened after the death of Saddam Hussein. There was, an executive gap to fill in. Shia militias groups, when there is turmoil, can easily gain control and power. And so once you obtain supplies from Iran, from the Quds forces, they organize and they form a Kataib Hezbollah. So essentially the
So,
Hezbollah of Iraq.
essentially, an Iraqi Hezbollah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, because I know also many Shia militias later on, after of course the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the end of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, many Shia militias became part of the Iraqi army. And so technically, right now, as is happening in Syria right now with Bashar al-Assad, and the role that Iran has been playing in helping Assad maintain power, Iran has influence in Iraq, sorry, Syria, and Lebanon. This
In
axis of
fact,
resistance.
in fact, Qasem Soleimani used to call this sort of trio the axis of resistance:
There you go.
Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. So it was necessary for him to gain control of these three territories.
To not be for Iran to not be isolated anymore.
And exactly. Instead of being surrounded by enemies, starting to surround enemies,
Boom,
namely Saudi Arabia. Which
boom. They're the ones
just,
playing
just to
the
throw it
game.
out there. Just to throw it out there. It's a little nugget out there.
And but now, okay, so now we said that. So then, how was he killed? Because he was killed. I know that he was killed. As we all know, on January the 3rd, in 2020, of course. He was at the Baghdad International Airport with a bunch of Iraqi officials. Many also with the leader of the Iraqi Hezbollah, if I'm not
Exactly.
mistaken.
He died
Uh,
there as well.
Yes, and there was an attack by the U.S. military, by a U.S. military drone. I think it's called a Reaper, that killed both him and all the other members in the car he was traveling in instantly. The attack was instantaneous, and he was killed like that. I think the decision to kill Soleimani came from the Trump administration. Trump was presented by the Pentagon with a series of options on how to deal with the situation in Iran, and it was said that he was it was thought that he would, not choose the one to kill him, but he ended up choosing the option of killing Soleimani as the solution. And so, the question emerges then, why was he killed?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I'll probably say that a potential, thing to date back to is the USA withdrawal from the agreement with Iran, maybe.
The nuclear, you mean the nuclear, the JPCOA, or what's known as the Iran nuclear deal?
Yeah, what do you think about it?
Yeah, no, I think, like you said, any act comes from a certain place. Like, there's an origin to everything, and I think before the killing of Soleimani, there was a significant tension especially between Iran and the U.S., which all started, as you mentioned, in May of 2018, when the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and instated sanctions that led to severe economic consequences in Iran. I think that, yes, this was the main instigating incident, though some may point to other previous ones. But we see that after this incident, tensions start to rise. We see that, for example, in April of 2019, the U.S. brands the Iran Revolutionary Guards, which is the main military group or the main military force of Iran, as a terrorist organization. From May to November of 2019, Iran starts to enrich in uranium past the certain amount, past the agreed point by the nuclear Iran deal. I think you might remember in June and July, there were the attacks of, May and June, there were the attacks by, it is said to be Iran, or at least Iran proxies, of
The Gulf of Oman.
In the Gulf of Oman, yes, many ships, certain ships bringing oil from the Middle East to international markets were attacked by what was thought to be Iran. There was also in September the attack on the Saudi oil refinery, which was the biggest in the world. So you see that in the long period of 1 year, the tensions between Iran and the U.S. prior to the killing of Soleimani weren't exactly stable. It was a growing tension between the two, and so this is why
I think the escalation then took probably even a higher lip in around December of the same year, probably just a few days before he got killed. Just to mention a rocket attack, which was conducted by Iraqi Hezbollah, in which a U.S. civilian was killed, and some, members from the U.S. and Iraqi military services were actually wounded. And this led to some retaliation from the part of the United States. For example, on December 29th, there was an airstrike. It was conducted in the northern of Iraq by the United States against members of Iraqi Hezbollah, in which about 25 of them actually died. So, the U.S. took this situation quite seriously. Yeah. And then probably the worst thing, which probably was the biggest reason why then, Soleimani was killed, was the fact that the U.S. embassy was actually attacked in Baghdad around the 31st of December. So in December, the situation completely escalated, went completely out of control.
Yeah, in fact, Trump, as I mentioned, was presented by the Pentagon certain options to take in what was deemed a situation of crisis. So he had to choose by a certain amount of choose one option out of many to deal with this escalating crisis, and he chose this one to kill Soleimani. So the question I also want to know is if it was legal and if it made sense to kill him.
Okay, this is where I think the killing gets a little bit tricky and difficult to understand because
Okay.
the legal basis is quite unclear. Now, if we take into account the perception of international law, the legality basis seems a little bit shaky because, the Charter of the United Nations, for example, allows a country, which in this case would be the United States, to use force in another country, which in this case would be Iraq, where Soleimani was obviously killed, if in fact consent has been given. Now, Iraq gives always, since basically 2002, consent to the United States to conduct operations within its territories if in fact there is a potential threat that comes within Iraq, from Iraq, and then can potentially lead to repercussions in both the US and Iraq.
Yep.
So in this
So
perception,
then Iraq needs to essentially give its the green light to the U.S. to conduct any operations if deemed necessary.
yes, but basically it always does because it's a sort of an agreement which was established between the US and Iraq. But the problem was that this particular case, now the death of members, for example, of Iraqi Hezbollah from this perception is totally fine and justified. Why? Because they are a threat potentially from the security of Iraq. Democratic Iraq could potentially be damaged by them, and also a threat to the United States. Well, the problem was that a military, commander from another country was killed, and this is not something
Yeah.
Iraq can give its consent to. And this is definitely a problem. And actually, the UN Special Rapporteur said that the assassination, basically most likely violated both international law as well as human rights law. So, from an
Okay.
international law perspective, the justification it's quite shaky and probably not very strong.
Okay. Well then that we can't really do anything about that. The law is what it is. But what we can try and see and maybe debate is about whether it made sense to kill him. As we mentioned, setting aside the legal question, which you addressed, saying that most likely it wasn't legal to kill him. He was a bad person. He, of course, conducted many militias. I think that regardless of what he did, his killing, at least from the perspective of the U.S., doesn't make sense, or in the sense that the costs outweigh the benefits.
Well, again, those kind of situations is probably difficult to assess it, but I would just simply say that he was designated as a terrorist by the United States in 2005. It was personally sanctioned both by the United Nations and the European Union, and he was essentially the leader of the group that should have brought Iran to gain control of the whole Middle East. This means allies of the United States also. So
Yeah, I get it. Okay, yes, he was a bad person, and he wanted Iran to have the whole control of the Middle East. But you have to consider that both the Bush and Obama administration didn't want, considered the assassination of Soleimani, but in the end rejected it as being too risky. Because you have to think about it. Yes, even though he was the head of the Quds forces, even though he wanted to expand Iranian influence in the Middle East, his death nonetheless has some certain repercussions that now we're dealing with. As we saw, the attack on Soleimani, who, as you mentioned, was the second most important person in Iran, sort of united, and essentially united the whole country. Many factions in Iran, or many parts of Iran society, also in the government, who were more moderate or even potentially against Soleimani, united against this attack because, of course, it's an attack against the sovereignty of a state. If you attack my general, you're essentially attacking the state. So it has the negative consequence of uniting the whole country, which perhaps wasn't united. This doesn't go in the interest of the United States.
yeah, this might be true, but I think the unification was not totally true, or at least it didn't last that much, because as early as the 8th of January, when the infamous attack against the Boeing 737-800, basically an Ukraine plane that was conducted in Tehran, by the way, by the Iranian forces, right away show that in the end, the population thinks that to a certain extent, the government is probably not doing its interests, because most of them decided to protest again what have happened, because in the end, the government thought that a missile, well, a plane actually, was a missile, and so they decided to put it down. Well, the problem was that 176 passengers were killed, and people from that, from that point decided to protest against the Iranian government for, a conflict that doesn't really make much sense in the end.
Okay, fine. Even if this unification of the country didn't last for long, because as you mentioned, on the 8th of January, the fact that the Boeing 737-800 was shot down by Iranian officials, and this led to counteract the unification that was occurring in Iran. You still have to consider that the fact that after the assassination of Soleimani, the Iraqi government responded by essentially passing in parliament a demand for the U.S. to withdraw, and all other foreign forces to withdraw their troops from Iraq. In 2014, the U.S. led a coalition in Iraq to fight against ISIS. Now, by having killed Soleimani on Iraqi territory, it's not in Iran, it's in Iraq, what the U.S. essentially did was antagonize itself in the eyes of many Iraqi officials, which led the Iraq parliament to push a request for the U.S. to withdraw its troops, which had happened in the end. Germany, Canada, and the U.K. After this demand was made, started withdrawing parts of their forces and reducing troop numbers in Iraq. Of course, the U.S. along with France protested, but we saw in February that the Trump administration had to concede to a certain extent and agreed to the withdrawal of a certain amount of troops in Shia-dominated areas, which in the end isn't very beneficial for the U.S. The U.S. has a vested interest in maintaining troops in the area to fight also against ISIS. But this killing of Soleimani just doesn't allow for a certain cooperation that existed before between Iraq and the U.S.
Well, I think the whole situation in Iraq it's probably a little bit exaggerated. I mean, Iraq it's kind of like the Afghanistan. It's one of those failed states where you just don't know how the power is organized. And, the repercussions that have been made, for example, even by Iran, have, a little bit extremized, I think. For example, the only thing that has been reported thus far, other than the killing of 176 passengers in the Boeing, is 22 ballistic missiles, which were launched against basically two bases which were hosting U.S. Militaries. And actually, nobody was killed. Nobody was wounded.
Right.
So if these are the repercussion or the retaliation, well, it's not that strong. It probably show that in the end, it wasn't that risky to kill such an important, powerful person.
Fine. Yeah, I get what you mean. What's it called? The Iranian retaliation was essentially that they sent 22 missiles to some U.S. military bases, and then
nobody killed, nobody wounded. That was it. That was the Ayatollah called it a slap in the face.
Okay, but the thing is, Iran can't really. I have to admit, to a certain extent, that Iran can't really retaliate fully.
They are basically isolated, as you said. As you said, they are isolated. It's pretty difficult for them.
And the U.S. Military arsenal is matched to no potential country.
I would say it's
a coalition of countries to a certain extent. And so there's no way that Iran is going to attack the U.S. even in a way, or that even World War III was ever going to emerge, because nobody's ever going to think that.
But I think it's sure. Quds forces now have a new leader, right?
Yes. And the thing is, right now, the question is, so what's going to happen now that Soleimani was killed? What is the next move? What is the result of this? The whole consequence is that now we have a new leader of the Quds Force, and this guy is called Esmail Qaani. I have to look that up. how to pronounce that. Ismail Khani. And so the question is he going to be better? Is he going to be worse? Is this new replacement a potential benefit for the U.S. And for Europe, or is it worse if he's more aggressive than Soleimani?
I mean, he was basically a spy, so he was always under the radar. So
Yeah,
trying to
wasn't he
assess
the second man, the right hand man of Soleimani?
yeah, and so he was under the shadow for most of it, and so it's quite difficult to assess it. All we know, experts have described him as less experienced than Soleimani, which kind of makes sense. I think to really understand whether the U.S. made a right move is to see if, in fact, this person does not have the same strategic capability of Soleimani.
Okay,
If
but
the
think about
various
it.
Shia militias lose the connection with Iran, then it could be a good move
Okay, but
by the United States.
when you think about it, yeah, he might be less experienced, but he nonetheless has a significant amount of a significant connection with many African militia groups, some that are Shia extremist groups. He in the 1990s sent arms shipment to Gambia. And I think, and he also helped create Afghan and Pakistani militia groups in Syria to fight for the Syrian government. So he's not some nobody. He nonetheless has the connections and I think the experience to be a certain pain for the U.S.
I mean, this I can't say nothing to that. You're perfectly right, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I still have to just hold on to what the experts say because again, he was a spy, basically. So we do not have much of information about him. So we'll just have to wait and see. All I actually heard about him is that once he quoted that Iran has buried many like Trump and know how to fight against America. But I don't think that real conflict is going to happen. But there
Well,
is
you need to put
thing.
on
I mean,
the.
this is going to recur. I'm going to become a meme. By the way, I'm going to become a meme because this is going to happen every single week. I mean, I've warned you already. If you want to launch the meme, I think this could be good for publicity purposes. Just launch the meme right away. I think. Yeah, I tried to make. See, I was very like, how would you say it? I was very smooth. I was like faking it, but you can't fake it.
I noticed. I
You
noticed.
fail. I
Yeah,
tried
you
to
can't
make. I
really
tried to
fake.
make nothing happen, but I completely failed. I completely failed.
It's amazing because it always falls towards the end of the episode. So with that, we can
Always.
end this episode because I mean it was an interesting conversation. We talked about
It's
who Soleimani was,
yeah.
why he was killed, how he was killed, and whether it makes sense. I, in the end, think that it didn't make sense to kill him. It makes more sense perhaps to cut the Iranian ties with the militia groups. Try to do that. Try to isolate once again Iran by killing him. You just made Iran angrier, wanting revenge, and perhaps looking abroad, looking beyond the Middle East to try and expand its influence.
And I personally would say that it made actually quite sense if, in fact, as I think, and as probably the U.S. think, he was the mastermind behind this connection of Shia militias.
Okay.
Well, then killing the mastermind could actually be a very good move. But I guess only time will tell, right? The
We
only
just have
thing
to
that
sit
we
down and
know,
wait.
yeah, the only thing that we know this program is that my headphones have some trouble staying in. That's the only thing we can assess for, yeah.
Your earplugs. What we know now is that your earplugs aren't working, and that's the most important thing right
Exactly.
now. Okay, well then, on that note, we can end it here. And
Yep.
thank you
It's
guys
been a
for.
pleasure as always.
It's a pleasure. Thank you guys for watching, and we will see you next week with a new episode and a new topic. Bye
Stay
bye.
home, stay safe, wash your hands.
And there you go. And stay home and stay safe. Bye bye.